So yesterday we were talking about General Qi Guang. Do we know anything about him? Is it his personal life or anything else?
So he's really interesting. Turns out we actually know rather a lot about him. And last year, it was last year, I was reading another person's dissertation, new scholar, Baron van Noordem. Very interesting dissertation on Qi Guang and a lot of his circle. And so Qi Guang was connected. Well, it wasn't. I think it was also about. This is my brain is all confused because I slotted it into too many. He was also talking about Wang Yangming, who was late. I guess you would call it a Neo-Confucian. I don't use that term technically anymore.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons that, if you really want to go to sleep early, I can give you. But so there are two major Neo-Confucian thinkers in the last 1,000 years. One is a guy named Jiu Jitsu, who's 12th century. And he's very scholastic in what he does. And he's usually the guy people talk about. But Wang Yangming, who's another 16th century figure, is actually much more important for the last 500 years or so. 400, and change years. Wang Yangming, who is this great, he's a government official. He's a Confucian thinker. He also oversees a campaign to suppress a rebellion by minorities in which they basically commit genocide. He's also part of a very interesting circle so Wang Yangming is actually involved in military activity. And he's part of a circle of people connected to Qi Guang's part of these groups, and they are not exclusively scholars. They're not exclusively what we call Ru or literati. Classicists. And they're all about, if you're moral, you should act. Like, morality will cause you to act. If you're not acting, you can't just sit there and read a book and be moral. Right. And so there's a very interesting connection between Qi Guang and these Confucians, these Neo-Confucians, these what I would say Ruists, and a lot of other people. So there's something very interesting happening in that time. So we do know about stuff. In English, like I said, there's this one book on Qi Guang that came out recently that I had a piece in. I think Ken Swope had a couple of pieces in, and it's very good. We do know a lot about him. He's a very significant figure. But what I haven't seen in English, and to be honest with you, I haven't looked in Chinese, although it's got to be there. There isn't a really good biography of him.
So if we know a lot about him, why, I guess my question would be, how did he become this pivotal figure out of everyone else that we can now use as I find, maybe you don't, I know this period isn't your favorite, but the Ming and the Qing are very interesting to me because of the root of all the stuff that I've done for 21 years. But what I found particularly fascinating with your book was I had read about him in Douglas Wile's works years before, but for some reason, I don't know if it was the way the book was formatted or if I was more interested in some other aspects. I even have highlighted notes about him in that. But when I read your book, for some reason, it stuck in my craw because of the significance of the survey he did in Yantai, which for us, like Mantis boxing comes from Shandong province, and Yantai was the hotbed of it, the birthplace, really. And here he is in Yantai in 1560, writing down these are the styles of martial arts or Chinese boxing that people are working on, and nowhere in there is there mention of eagle claw or praying mantis or tiger claw or white crane or any of these things that showed up later in the late Qing dynasty.
in the best of all possible worlds, where you either have a lot of graduate students around who are funded and can get them jobs, so it's okay to have them around, and they're interested in this. Look, this stuff could be sorted out.
Yeah.
If it hasn't, like I said, I'm supposed to be in China next year for a year. I'll probably have more chance to wander into bookstores and look around.
Mm.
I looked up. So we have digital. They have digitized the local histories.
Yeah. Yes.
And we have Vanderbilt has access to a good number of them. Our library is infinitely better over the last 20 years. It's fantastic how much better it is. And so I got in and I've been poking around. The problem is, so you can go look at this stuff, and I was trying to track down, what are can we find some of these people that show up in Chi Guang's manual? And I didn't look up those. I was looking for some other things. You can run these searches. Now you might not find them because they didn't, and that will be interesting too. But of course, we're always arguing from lack of evidence is always a problem. It's a big no-no in history. You can't. Someone says, and we get this as historians all the time. There's someone's like, particularly like martial arts people, are much more. They have a lot more at stake in the martial arts history than they have in any of the other things I've written. So people get really pissed off at me because they're like, well, you can't tell me that, Zhang Sanfeng didn't live in the Song dynasty. And I said, well, no. And I have run the searches, the digital searches. He shows up in no texts. That name doesn't show up in Song dynasty text. It's like, yeah, so he could have been there. So you can't prove to me he didn't. It's like, that is true,
Right.
So I
can't prove that Santa Claus didn't.
Santa Claus didn't show up either, and a lot of things didn't show up. A lot of things that to me are a lot more important didn't show up. Like, I have fragmentary evidence on gunpowder, and I've got all the documents on that, and they're just not that many.
Right. But when you have somebody like Chi Guang that writes down what is there at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty good indication. And again, not 100%, but it's a pretty good indication. Well, if he's listing a survey of all these things that people are doing in the martial arts world, and nowhere do you see this. And the one that stood out to me that I thought was really interesting was monkey boxing.
Yeah.
That monkey boxing did show up. So it's still alive today in some fragmented form, and who knows if it's anything similar to what it was then, but that was very interesting.
Yeah, well, it's like, oh, I've taken them down. Oh, no, they're over there. I have, now that I'm in my office, so it's the office side of it. So this is his training manual. Here's the earlier and the later one.
Oh, nice.
So this is Jishao Shinshu, and so, we have these texts, and actually, there was another book he wrote in between the two editions.
Okay.
Some of which has been translated in last couple of years. Someone translated parts of it in the Journal of the Chinese Military History Society.
Okay.
Well, I'm trying to think when that was. Again, I too much stuff passes in front of me. So so the problem that I have, like I said, someone could really do a lot of work on him. He's actually, it turns out, a very important figure. Now the question is whether he's an important figure historiographically.
Yeah.
And of course he was important. He helped put down the pirate campaigns. He was active on the northern border against the Mongols in between. He's become for me a much more pivotal figure because of what he wrote down. Because the text he writes in between, which name escapes me at the moment, and I don't want to stop this video while I browse through texts.
Yeah, that's okay.
And I wrote about this. He actually talks about how our only advantage over the Mongols is guns.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so some of my guess at the moment, and this is just circumstantial from the very limited number of documents that I've happened to run into, is that the difference between the 1560 Xiu and the 1584 Xiu is he gets more guns in his hands. And the availability, not that the technology was new. They had the technology before that. That's not the issue. It's they get more guns in their hands, and then suddenly in the first manual he's being sent down to clear up a mess.
Right.
So he's like, let's forget about the hereditary military families because they haven't been maintained and they don't know what they're doing. Let's recruit new guys. If we recruit new guys, we have to train them a different way. Or maybe he's thinking, see, this is what's really critical in this. Why we need a better study of this is he going in there and saying, okay, we need to change the way we're doing things because we have these new non-military people coming in. And then he does that for a while. And after a while he goes, yeah, that didn't really work. Discard that stuff and move on, maybe. Or did he say, well, this worked up to this point. Things have changed. The reason why I was doing that was I had to make do with what I had.
Right.
Now we have guns. Let's face it, that stuff doesn't really help us on the battlefield. Or maybe now I've got more professional soldiers. I don't need to develop this aggressive sense. I don't know. Something changed, and what's fascinating about him is that you have an early version, a later version, you have a text in between. We know about this guy, we know his circle of people. He's written about, there's texts. So I'll probably end up, because of the connection both to gunpowder and martial arts, I've been drawn more and more into reading on him.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that Baron van Noordam goes further on some of that stuff. I don't know when he defended the dissertation. What was it? Like I said, 2 years ago? I had to, go be at his defense, which was awesome. Really cool. It's in Leiden, and they do it in this 15th century building in this room. And
nice.
It's really cool, but he did this wonderful dissertation, and so he's done that. Now, like I said, I mentioned this other guy, Israel Kanner, the other day, who's done this. So there are these new scholars coming in who are working on some of these things and related to some of these things. It's really interesting. I support them as much as I can, which is very little given the reason. I just don't have the thing. So he's really important. But he was an important general. So maybe because he was an important general, those writings about unarmed combat had more, they carried over more. If he were no one, it wouldn't have mattered. Every time you get some general who tries to capitalize on, I was a winning general, so now I'm going to write a book. And then some of them, it's like, what's that book, American Sniper? And what's interesting about that is I was sent that book, but I was like, oh gosh, it's another one of these, because the year before there was a book on Navy SEAL sniper in the same time period, in the same stuff. This guy Wasden or something like that. And so I had read that, and I was like, oh shoot, another sniper book.
Yeah. And it's funny because there's the one that really kicked them all off is the one that is about Carlos Hathcock.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
Yeah.
And he had like 93 confirmed kills in Vietnam, and was it the White Feather?
He used to have the longest kill shot in history, was 2,500 meters or something like that.
Yeah. Insane. Yeah. So, but why did Chris Kyle's book become, sort of get made into a movie and become all that, get a lot of attention? But this other guy's book, who was the year before, which was essentially the same thing, and also, our special forces guys, and why didn't, and I'm sure that guy's sitting there going, why didn't my book?
It might have just been the story, like, because Chris Kyle ended up being killed by someone he was trying to help. So it might have just been, it was more dramatic for Hollywood.
Yeah. And so, but for, why was Chi Guang so important? Well, yes, he was an important guy. Importantly, he wrote, and that's critical. I always say to students, history is written by the historians, and if you don't write stuff down, it doesn't get written. No one can read it.
So an offshoot of this, because
Yeah.
you were mentioning Confucius a minute ago,
Yeah.
and when I first started talking to you about a problem I was having in my research with tracing back the Mantis boxing lineage,
Yeah.
with this connection to the plum blossom boxing and this other stuff,
Yeah.
and you had sent me in the direction, I forget the direction you sent me at this point, but you helped kind of throw a breadcrumb, try this. Well, when we were at the conference in LA last year, I was able to sit down with Tom Green, who actually co-wrote that paper with Guodong on the plum blossom boxing.
Yeah.
And he wasn't able to answer the question, but I was able to sit with him and Jared and Ben Judkins and have this like pose the questions that I had.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because in that discussion about the plum blossom stuff, it came up with the founder of Mantis Boxing, that his whole origin story is an exact replica of Confucius.
Oh.
So can you comment on that as far as what role like Confucius played in people possibly ripping off his origin story? Like what significance
my goodness,
does that have?
Well, so this is where you run into this problem of what the one of the greatest sins you can make in history is to read things transparently, which is to say, the text says, the moon is made out of green cheese. So you go, well, the text says that, so that it must be, or
be true.
It says I grew up here and I did this, and so that's what, and so what. Let me give you a similar example, which is the biography of Sun-Tzu in the records of the Grand Historian in the Shiji. And anybody who's a credible scholar knows that that biography is nonsense. It's a technical term for it, which I forget at the moment, which is basically, it's a mirror image. It's not even a mirror, it's just a copy of this other famous general Wu Zishu's. So then you have this kind of this mythical figure or a figure in the case of Gong, a Master Gong, he was almost certainly a historical figure who is mythologized.
Right.
In the case of Master Swin, it seems there might have been some guy, Master Swin, but the image we have of him is entirely mythology.
Okay.
And so what you have is a trope, right? You have what kind of guy this was. Well, here's our ideal kind of person like that. And obviously this person must be the ideal person kind because they're our ideal.
Right.
So you always have, your martial arts teacher is always this guy who was a great fighter, but, he didn't want to fight, but then he learned this thing and then he get,
right.
We see the movies, they're always like that, right? We're kind of
only so many origin stories and they all copy each other.
Yeah. And so I would just assume that's, you tend to fit people get fit into types. And this is a pretty well-known thing. Again, if you, the interesting thing, if we go back to the Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian, is that Sima Qian has a couple of levels of these idealization, these ideal biographies. First of all, he's choosing exemplars. So he doesn't choose the people. So he has categories of biography. Here are the Ru, the Confucians. Here are the militarists, the Bingjia, and that's that term jia again, which why you don't translate it as style, because it's, who's in the Bingjia? Well, Sun-Tzu, Wu-Tzu, and Sun Bin. And so you look at that and you say, okay, so these are the ideal types. And then here are the ideal scholars. Okay. So first of all, you choose who you're going to talk about, because you have an idea of who the guys are, and then you fit their stories in. So, like, I'm not going to be chosen as an ideal scholar because I'm not an ideal scholar, right? I didn't do this, I did do that. So if you're going to say, so that's why when you look at these martial arts origins, well, yeah, you get a mythologized form, and you can deal with it. That's the point. That's why we learn historical methodology. There's a certain amount that you can learn, and there's a lot you can't. So my answer to that would be, probably once you start getting a mythologized version, then you might be able to track back and see, is there something earlier?
Okay.
But sometimes you won't get that, right? Because and then you get a huge amount of resistance from people who, for some reason, have an investment in that mythologized figure.
Oh, he's preaching to the choir on that one. Yeah.
So this is back to me, the Tai Chi people who got really pissed off at Stan Henning years ago for sort of saying, this is mythologized stuff, and that doesn't, it doesn't. I'm not I make this. I put the ideas of Shaolin in a historical context, and there are people like, oh, he doesn't even believe Shahar on this, and I'm like, well, read Shahar. Shahar is an excellent scholar. He did a lot of good work, but you can see the separation where he's like, okay, here's the historical record. Here's what it means. And then there's the points where he's a little more credulous than I'm comfortable with.
Okay.
Because it's back to that speculation, right?
Right.
So, it's very clear to me that if you look at the records, that Shaolin was an important place in the Ming Dynasty for martial arts. It was not an important place in the Qing Dynasty for martial arts. It was not an important place in the Sung Dynasty. It was not an important place in the Tang Dynasty, for martial arts.
Right.
People went there. That's the thing. Back to that, what can you argue from lack of records is you have people who are going to Shaolin, and they're talking about, we're hanging out with the monks doing Buddhism, and
Well, that was, and I actually, I'm glad you brought that up because, I found that part of your book very educational and enlightening. Was the part about Shaolin and that this idealization we have of the monk, the fighting monk, and how you kind of disperse that idea or dissolve that idea, where it's like, no, these guys were hired thugs that shaved their head and wore robes, and they looked like monks, but they were drinking and boozing and womanizing and doing all this stuff because they were really bandits. And that was very, very interesting.
Yeah, but that's what pisses people off, right? Because this goes back to I gave a talk many years ago in, was it Ball State or something like that, for Ken Swope. He had his class on the origins of Kung Fu, and basically I was using Kung Fu Panda, where he goes that weird thing of Master Shifu. It's like Master.
Yeah, I know, Master Father.
Well, it's like, but they go back to the origin of martial arts. The origin of Kung Fu is a place, the Pool of Tears or something like that, Sacred Pool of Tears or something like that, where a guy, Wu Hui, this turtle named Turtle, he created, Kung Fu at that time, at that place, by this person.
Oh, and it's like Bodhidharma.
Yeah. And it's invincible. And the issue is, if you could get the further you get from him, the less strong it is. The closer back to him and that origin you get, the more powerful it is.
Interesting.
And if you could get back to that original origin, that unitary origin, that pure thing, you would be invincible. And if you will, that's a lot of the origin of the traditional martial arts, the ideology of the traditional martial arts, which is, there is this founder. This founder was invincible. You could say he broke from the past or whatever, but this founder, he realized a truth
Yeah.
Or in the case of Wing Chun, Yong Chun, you'll get this Shi, which of course, then that's Stan Henning had a whole thing about about the myths of that, but I don't think he ever published it, which was, Stan found some Ming military officer who had ended up back and created Yong Chun probably in Yong Chun. And it was a simplified version of the stuff he studied. But if you could get back to that origin, the founder is invincible. And then it's just a question of how close are you to the founder and his perfect system. Yeah. And any deviation from that, or if you say, well, I only know, you've been doing this, right, where you're combining Tanglong with BJJ. And then you say, well, what, you can't do that. Well, because that's implicitly, you're saying that there's a lacuna in our fighting system. That's no good.
Right. And, I had this discussion with Sensei Ando, who runs a YouTube channel. And
yeah, I watched your video with him.
Oh, good. Nice.
Yesterday, after we talked, I was like, oh.
Where people, it's kind of like you're practicing a dead man's art.
Yeah.
And insisting that that's the truth, that's the reality. And it locks you in this box where you're now tied to that and you're no longer innovating. And it's funny because when we're alive, people criticize the actions that are later idealized. And it's like, oh, this person, they broke the mold and they did this and it was unheard of. And they blended these things and they're awesome and amazing. Wait, you're doing the same thing? Oh, you're horrible. You're trash. You shouldn't be doing that. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're talking about. It's such a hypocritical mindset.
Well, but you have to, I try to think about it in terms of humility and arrogance, which is, if you do it, you're so arrogant as to presume to change things. If you succeed, then and then you succeed, and then someone says, oh, well, that person was innovative because they succeeded. They obviously they were, it's the end result. Right. I'm doing Chinese military history, and I'm not, I always say to people that no one ever declared me brilliant for good reason. I'm not. I'm just proceeding along an obvious path.
The same with me. It's like, I'm not trying to do anything and be some pivotal figure. I'm just filling this hole. It's like, we don't have anything in Chinese boxing that can handle the ground fighting.
Yeah.
So it's an obvious hole and a very big one. Yeah. As you know, being a jiu-jitsu practitioner, you end up on the ground with somebody and they've got 6 months of high school wrestling. You're done.
Okay. Yeah, you're done. Oh, no.
You're smoked.
The wrestlers it just sucks, particularly some young wrestler.
Yeah. So you've got to have an answer and a solution for that. And that's all, it's just like you said, following an obvious path. And
but then, you're an idiot until you're brilliant.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be a middle ground.
Like Picasso or.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And when you.
Copernicus or Galileo.
Yeah. And then you're pivotal. And even if you're not trying to be, so as an academic, I write things that are for the most part read by a very small number of people. Yeah. And if I'm lucky, it has a positive effect on a fairly small number of people. And I'm fine with that. I'm not looking.
Yeah, that is fine. It's move things by one small pebble, right? That's how you move a mountain.
And so if someone contacts me and says, oh, would you do this? I read this thing and it was really helpful. Oh, that's great. So that I help that person intellectually. And of course, as a Chinese historian, you feel the tradition in ways that I never felt it in the West when I was doing Western history, because it's an unbroken historical tradition. So you read all these guys, and then you're reading their documents, and then you're writing your thing in English using their documents and critiquing their documents in a very similar way that they critiqued the previous people. So you just feel like the least good at Chinese person in this tradition. And you say something, and then the most positive thing I felt from a personal point of view was I was in Anhui for a conference. They invited me to come out to China and to speak on Chinese martial arts history.
That's a big honor.
Yeah, well, and so I got out there and I gave my talk, and I don't even remember what I was talking about at the time. And then afterward, they put us. It was very funny because it's big chairs that we sat on stage in this.
Yeah.
But a Chinese graduate student, stands up and he said, "Look, I read your book, and could you add some of these questions for me?" And another student said, "Yeah, I tried to get your book and I couldn't get it, but and I thought, isn't it a wonderful world where, again, as the least good at Chinese person in this tradition,
Right.
that somebody who's Chinese, who's thinking about this too, is not going to discount what I have to say, and is going to, now they may be the most enlightened or open-minded people around, those two guys I ran to,
Yeah.
but they went and you say, okay, I'm part of this larger discussion,
Right.
rather than I'm off in the West over here and they're doing that. And I very much appreciated that, because you always have this feeling when you're dealing with somebody else's culture, that they look at you and they say, well, it's a obvious racial or even cultural thing. What could you possibly know about my culture? So that was very, and to realize that at the end of the day, you're just trying to fit into the culture, you're trying to fit into this lineage, not stand outside of it.
Right.
But if you do something really that seems obvious to you at the time, which is tremendously significant later, like, say, perhaps Qi Guang's. I don't think Qi Guang was trying to innovate.
No. I mean, he had a practical reason for doing it. It just became such a pivotal thing as far as our Chinese martial arts history.
Yeah. And so in later times, you hope that you did something positive and useful and correct. That's always a terrifying one when you're writing. You write all this stuff out, and then it's sitting in this room at this desk writing all these things, and then you kind of go out occasionally and say to people, you hold up something and say, "Is this okay?" And some people go, and hopefully someone at some later point just says, "Oh, actually this was real." And yes, in some egotistical way, you keep hoping that you're going to say something, and then it's going to stimulate a whole lot of people to be able to study that, to be able to work off that.
I don't argue with your use of the word egotistical there, but as human beings, we are also altruistic in a societal structure or the tribe. Like we want to contribute something. We want to be of import. So I know what you mean egotistically, but it's also, I think, a level of altruism. It's like, I want to do something that's significant that other people value, not because I get some endorphin rush or like, yeah, look what I did, but because it's I did something of value. I did something important to somebody else. And
I mean, but you have to remember that academics are very egotistical.
Martial artists.
Well, no, but let me clarify what I mean by that. And martial artists is, you hope to go into it and find out that you're just an amazing talent and you'll be better than everyone else. And after a while, most of us find that that's not the case. But the difference between, say, teaching and book writing is that, I teach a bunch of students. Have I succeeded? Is it good? I don't really know.
Yeah.
I don't have a concrete thing. And let's say I'm a fantastic teacher and all these students are positively affected by that. I probably don't know. But also, once I'm done teaching and those people, there could be someone sitting there saying, "Oh, that was a great class," or "I learned something." When you write a book, it's this concrete thing with your name on it, that you're fitting it into this lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And we're very obsessed with lineage, and we're very obsessed with lineages of knowledge. And so someone in the future is going to say, you're there, you existed.
Right.
Whereas you can teach all you want. And again, we're back to the same thing with Qi Guang. Nobody writes it down. this guy was a great teacher I had in some place that is recordable, that is findable, then
Right.
it's ephemeral. And
Yeah, it's like it didn't happen.
yeah, whereas, you know, the Shiji, the record, you know, Sima Qian writes this letter that we have in which he talks about, because he was, you know, castrated, and he decided instead of committing suicide, he accepted castration so he could finish this history.
Wow.
And he writes a letter.
That's dedication.
Yeah, and I tell students, you know, I'm not dedicated like that.
Neither am I.
Yeah, okay, yeah. But
I'll take it to the grave.
yeah. But he writes a letter that we have in which he explains his decision to suffer the worst humiliation in order that he could create this work, which would, he hoped, be recognized by some future extraordinary person, Qiren, who would appreciate him.
And what was the work that he wrote?
The Records of the Grand Historian, or the
Okay.
And it's
what year was that?
Sorry?
What year was that?
Oh, what is it? 2nd century BC.
I
realized it. It's something like that. It's gonna be terrible. I'm gonna find it. Oh shoot. It's
if you think of it later, let me know and I can add it as a subtext.
Yeah. He screwed up. This is what he but it's one of those texts that I'm always referring to, and then I write it down and I double checked it when I'm writing, and then I forget when I'm speaking. But it's one of the most significant historical texts, probably the most historical. I mean, you're going to have an argument with another sinologist about that. The most important historical text, certainly the most important imperial Chinese historical text. And he becomes very famous. And in fact, he succeeds beyond his wildest imagination, because his history becomes the core historical work, which becomes the model for everyone, and his writing style becomes. But that's your ego for you, and now you're just trying to fit into those traditions. But we're acutely aware of the fact that, you know, most of the people I read in classical Chinese, in literary Chinese, are other historians.
Yeah.
So I'm just very conscious of being part of that lineage. And I can break down for you my intellectual lineage even here, you know, my teacher and where his teacher was, and how that, and so it's very similar to martial arts. It's, you know, where did you get that from, where, but the difference is we write it down. Yeah. You can attribute, you can understand that. So, you know,
so I want to get to this hotbed question.
Okay. Can we offend someone?
What's that?
Can we offend someone?
Yes, I'm sure it will. So let me read an excerpt from your book.
Okay. You do
it's
that.
Actually a footnote.
Oh, that's important.
Wang Jiangnang, did I say that right?
Sounds like, yeah. Oh, you're going to go to the internal versus external question.
Yeah. I like to pick this scab.
It's a pretty big one for people, yeah.
So did I say his name right?
I think so. Wang Jiangnan. Yeah.
Wang Jiangnang was a master of two skills, one of pugilism and the other archery. From ancient times, great archers have been many, but when it comes to pugilism, truly Master Wang was the foremost. The external school of pugilism reached its highest development with Shaolin. Zhang Songfeng, having mastered Shaolin, reversed its principles, and this is called the internal school of martial arts. Acquiring even a smattering of this art is sufficient to overcome Shaolin. So that was very interesting to me when I read it, and I have some thoughts on it, but I wanted to get your take on it.
Okay.
You wrote it, so.
Well, I was quoting this is this guy's biography of Wang Jiangnan. Yeah.
Right. And so this is the first time that we see a mention of internal martial arts. Is that correct?
That I'm aware of.
In what year was this? Do you remember?
You'd have to look that. I have to pull.
Wang Zhengnong, 1617 to 1669.
Yeah, so 17th. So we're talking whatever. So 17th century. I mean, my guess would be, and of course, this is a highly politically inflected comment about him, and it has a lot to do with relationships of foreigners versus Chinese. I mean, this is back to that question of reading things transparently. So if we read it transparently, we say, okay, what is said in the biography of Wang Zhengnong is true. Well, who wrote it? Okay, well, the people writing it had an agenda. Did they invent this? Probably not as a concept. But at the moment, until somebody does some more research, that's our locus classicus for the moment. That's our first mention. There's a huge industry of people who want to connect, Qigong and all this internal stuff with martial arts. And I can't prove that didn't happen, but I also can't find any records that actually connect Daoyin. Qigong is the term is like 1934 or something like that. Or
okay.
Yeah, it's very late.
Fairly.
But again, is it a new term for an old thing? And well, there's Daoyin, which is an old practice and which is very similar, so maybe it is. The terminological issues.
I thought there was some. This is going back to something I read even maybe 20 years ago. I thought there was a record of that some of the Qigong movements, not necessarily that name, at the Shaolin Temple that dated back, like they're written in the wall, or they were.
Oh yeah, I don't. Well,
Or something.
I mean, the problem we have with all this is, so you see an image, and it looks from the past, and it looks like something you recognize from the present. Are they the same?
Right.
And so then you're into this problem of like, we don't have a necessarily historical solution to that. And then you run into this problem of arguing with people where they say, see, it goes back however many centuries.
Right.
And to which I say, I can't prove it. So from my point of view, it remains an open question. It remains unproven.
Right.
Does it matter to your practice?
Yeah.
And people want, for some reason, they want that historical connection.
It's validation. People want validation. That's a base human psychological need.
Well, yeah. How do we legitimize these practices we do? Look, I hopefully will never be in a real fight. So any martial arts techniques I have that might have some application in a fight, I never find out whether this script I've been given, it's a very interesting concept that Martha McCoy talks about, which is that this script that you're given about, if a fight happens, this is what's going to happen. So here we have this prescription for what you do. And so hopefully I never find out that what I was told was untrue.
Right.
And so, but unfortunately, I go into you and I say, okay, you're going to teach me this stuff, and does it have a self-defense application? You say yes, or we don't stress that, or whatever. But yes, okay. Well, why do I believe you? Oh well, and so that's why you have the guys who are trying to make a business who go and compete in jiu-jitsu, and some guy says, and I won this tournament, I won the worlds in this. You say, okay,
right.
That means you're good in that context.
Well, exactly. I mean, who showed up that day? I mean, that's a very small pool of people.
Yeah.
What was the shape of your opponent? Were they tired? Were they jet lagged? Were they sick? Were they at the top of their game?
Yeah.
You won, and that's awesome. But there's a lot of factors into winning, and there's two sides of it. But I many years ago when I was teaching, I came to the conclusion, because I came into schools that did both what are classified now as internal styles versus external.
Yeah.
And it would drive me crazy because I would go to the classes for what's classified as internal, like Xing Yi. I was studying Xing Yi Chuan and Tai Chi Chuan, and and they did Bagua as well, which I think that classification of those only came out of the Jin Wu, where because Xing Yi wasn't tied to that prior to.
But so there's the 7 big styles, and it's like Xingyi, Bagua, Taiji, Yongchuan. It might be, Meihua or something like. I can't remember all of the. There's a set, and that's all a late imperial, early, or late imperial Republican period formulation. Which again, I'm sure someone's written about. I'd like to find something on how that was done. And that's part of, but that's also, by the way, very much like this internal style thing, that was also a nationalistic issue.
Right. Exactly.
So, and so there's this notion that they're trying to say that China is a unified culture. And
battle the poor image they had to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, but also against the different provinces. The one of the things that you run into is, how does a Chinese person feel about the China as a whole, or are they in their local area?
Yeah.
And this is true in Europe. This is true in America. All these things, right? So this is not unique. And so what you do is you create this thing that spans all of it. So like I'm not a baseball fan, but okay, baseball, it's everywhere in America, right? So then you take this thing and you don't say, well, these different lineages of martial, they had nothing to do with each other. They were just, this local guy taught this, that local guy taught that.
Yeah.
And so, but the government says, okay, no, we're unified. These all have roots, they have lineages, they connect us all rather than separate us. And now we're going to create a curriculum, and we're going to train people in the TU Daxue, in the phys ed university, so that you can learn this curriculum and then go teach it to students as a gym teacher, and get a job. Back to the economic aspect, you get a job, rate the students, evaluate them, and put them into a national system. They could compete. Yeah. They could, and then of course they tried to create an international system, wushu as an international, and then they wanted to make it Olympic.
Right.
And so then we tie everyone to this unified system, and then when you start saying, it's not really the way it worked.
Right. Wait. You can't talk about that.
Yeah. And
but it would always baffle me, because the excuse with, say, Tai Chi or any of the internal stuff that you would hear is, well, you do external styles, so you start backwards. We start with the soft stuff, and after a while we gain power. And it's like, this is fantasy. This is, it's like, what planet do you reside on that you think that you're going to do this soft, slow movement in the air? And never hit anything, never put a pair of gloves on, never spar, but you're all of a sudden 20 years later going to be this amazing fighter that can just throw people without touching them. And these concepts personally, I would get frustrated by these conversations that I would hear people having, and they would defend their arts with this. But what I realized after years of coaching, I had this concept where I looked at a boxer, and because I taught Tai Chi for 13 years, and I taught boxing, and then I got into teaching Jiu Jitsu, what I noticed, common theme amongst all, is no one comes in coordinated and able to just do the moves. Very rarely. Occasionally you get somebody who's an athlete or something, or a dancer, and it doesn't mean they're doing it right. It just means that those people can make the motion. But no one starts out with balance, coordination, timing, strength, power, fluidity. And this, when I was reading this, I'll get back to your book in a second. What I noticed was, okay, you take a boxer, somebody who wants to do boxing, they come in and they put gloves on, and they start hitting the bag. It's very rigid, it's very stiff. Their body's fighting itself more than the bag. And only through tens of thousands of repetitions do they start to relax and internalize that movement. And they can now throw a punch with power because the entire body is connected to it, because there's no resistance from muscle to muscle. It's now there's now this fluidity. So that is one concept with the internal versus external. But when I read this excerpt from your book and the other stuff surrounding it, that you added your take on it and your history of it, that statement specifically reminded me of a friend of mine went to, I think it was Gracie or Hoyler. He went to one of their workshops, and my apologies for not saying who it was accurately, but they said to me that they were telling a story when they got their black belt, and that they immediately thought, oh, this is amazing. And followed right after that was, right now I have to learn everything from the other side. Yeah. Meaning, okay, now I learned the technique. Now I have to be able to take them apart or uncoil them. Right. And so when I read your excerpt, especially that Zhang Sengfeng, having mastered Shaolin, reversed its principles, and this is called the internal school. It's like, this is a really high level fighter that mastered the basics, got to that, use a belt as a term, got to that black belt level, and then learned how to take everything apart from the other end.
Yeah, I mean, so there's all that, and then there's the other. I mean, so I was aware of the fact that, you know, the problem that faces you now is not the problem that will face you in the future. Yeah, and it may not have been the problem. So what? And this is also why I you know, when you see people who are taking you know, hormone replacement or things like that too, you know, because okay, I'm getting older, and I think, yeah, you know, on one level I appreciate that, because it's hard enough if you're a stable target to figure out what to do now. The problem is, like, as I'm trying to figure out how to do these things, I'm aging. Right. And so in the same way that a younger person can put all the time and energy into training, you know, when I was doing Taekwondo when I was, you know, 20, right, I could go 4 to 6 days a week, and you know, I just can't train at those levels now. No,
but even then, if you were doing jiu-jitsu then, yeah, because I train with 20-year-old, they get injured too. Yeah. And, but you know, but just in terms of energy and recovery. And so, you know, if you think about the story of the O-sensei who creates Aikido, and that he goes through, that the Aikido he creates, and this goes back to our authenticity or our origins question again. Here's this guy whose practice changed over his very long life. Right. And he had these students who lived with him for years. So, you know, you go and you study with him, let's say early in his life, and, you know, you studied with him, you personally, you lived in his house, you were with him for years, you learn this art. You go, you leave him and you start a school and you say, this is authentic. Right. After you leave, this other guy comes in, he stays with him for the same, but his art has changed. Yes. And suddenly that guy comes out and says, no, you know, I'm authentic. And so we said, well, but they're different. Right. And they stress different things. And then you're like, well, which one's authentic? Well, you know, so is the authentic one, and of course, and then with the really troubling one, as when you're studying it yourself, is it the last thing I did, or the latest thing, the best one, right? Or did I go off in the wrong direction? You know, do you get to go full circle, come back, evaluate everything you did, say, actually, it turns out that the part 3/4 of the way through, or the part, you know, that was the best one, but also you're a different person. Well, and there's nothing more demoralizing as a teacher. Like, I had this happen to me where I had a guy I taught in 2005. Yeah. And he was just absolutely loved it. Yeah. this is the best thing I've ever done. And he was in his 40s.
Yeah.
The early 40s, late 30s, early 40s. And he had to move away for work. And he didn't study for me that long, maybe a year. He moves away and he comes back.
Yeah.
7, 8 years later. Well, what I was teaching was completely different.
Yeah.
And he comes back all gung-ho.
Yeah.
Like, I can't wait to train with you again. I've missed this so much. And he comes back and he's like, I don't like this. I mean, the amount of work you put in to try to make things better and improve and continually evolve. And then you have somebody say, yeah, I don't like that.
I look at the stuff that I did when I was teaching, academically. There were teaching techniques that I used, and some of them I dropped because I thought for twice as much effort, I can get a marginal improvement, maybe. And, or if I do this thing, maybe one student will get a lot more out of it if I do that thing, and the other students will be annoyed or they won't get anything out of it. But it takes me a lot more effort, and it's like, screw that. My emphasis is going to be on something else. And you find out that, and this student did really well with where you were at that time. And at that point, you just sort of throw your hands up in despair.
Yeah.
Because once you realize the constants of change, it becomes very hard to feel confident about anything, which is why we get back to, as a historian, the text. Because you can sit there and say, okay, here's the text, here's what I'm saying about it. Here's what other people have said about it, here's what I'm saying about it. Hand it on to the next person.
Right.
And you try to be as honest as possible, and I don't just mean truthful, I mean honest. And you hope that if you're being honest, someone in the future will say, they made they contributed something, I don't agree with it, but they're okay. As opposed to, man, that guy was an idiot. What kind, and of course in graduate school, you learn to be, graduate students are the most critical, harsh, because that's the first thing you learn is, don't just accept everything, attack everything you've been,
Right.
And then what happens, and then sometimes they look at you and say, well, why don't you do that? Say, well, because I wrote a book, and I found that it's really hard to write a book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have sympathy for, okay, there were some typos. I'm not going to get upset about someone for typos, or that the date on that thing wasn't perfect. As long as it didn't affect the main argument, as long as the person clearly knew what they were doing, if they make a couple of, minor errors here, I'm not going to worry about that. And even if their major point is wrong, but it was well argued and it was based on real information, and maybe that's fine.
This lives on in a form on YouTube now, because I never leave comments on people's videos that say anything derogatory or critical. And it's like, I run a channel and put out a ton of content, and I know what it's like to wake up and see just some jackass make some ridiculous statement, and like, it's great. This is what I start my day out with. So you kind of, once you put stuff out yourself, and usually that's a measure I'll use personally, is if somebody does leave a comment that criticizes something I do, I look, do they have a name? Do they have a picture? And do they have any content at all on their channel? And if they don't, then why bother responding? Because you have no idea yourself what it's like putting work out. If somebody does have stuff and they took the time to leave a criticism, great. Is it valid? And if it's valid, then admit it. If it's not, then move on. I mean, it's just interesting because YouTube is this newer thing, but it kind of, the same thing happens.
It's all the same thing. It's like the first time I was working on, I was working on De La Riva, and and I was looking up videos, and they're like, oh, and here's an interview with De La Riva. Wait, he's alive? Of course he's alive. He's not even that old, right?
No.
So and then you have some dream that, like, you'll come up with some move in
That will be named
jujitsu.
after you.
Yeah, that would be named after you, and then people are like, oh, that's that. And then, but can you imagine if you came up with 2 moves, and
Yeah.
then they'd have to be like, oh, well, what do we call
Or
this?
a whole guard that then
Oh yeah, yeah,
like
yeah,
a bunch of other techniques and
yeah.
just, yeah.
And then you have to ask the question: is De La Riva the best guy at De La Riva? Maybe he isn't, right? Even if it were,
Well, I'll tell you, and
yeah,
I know this isn't what we're talking about, but I got to tell you this
yeah,
because my BJJ teacher studied with De La Riva,
yeah,
and then so all the way up to brown belt,
yeah,
and De La Riva and Ricardo Laborio were both under Carlson Gracie,
yeah,
and they were school brothers. They
yeah,
like Laborio was at De La Riva's school a lot teaching. Well, Dedeco went and studied with Laborio,
yeah,
and that's where he got his black belt. But last year, it might have been 2018. I went to my first workshop with Ricardo Laborio and De La Riva in the same summer.
yeah.
Dedeco had them up, and it was hilarious because the first workshop with Laborio was, okay, this is how you take apart and disassemble the De La Riva guard. And a month later, De La Riva comes in and just starts showing these things that he's still working on.
Yeah,
Even now, new stuff. Like I was watching Dedeco's reaction.
yeah,
Who knows the De La Riva stuff inside and out?
yeah,
And he's been doing BJJ for 35 years. And I apologize if I got that number wrong, but since he was 12 years old,
yeah,
it's not like he's unfamiliar with what this stuff is, what it is, and he's watching De La Riva show something,
yeah.
and he's like, "My God, the guy's still like unlocking things and adding to the game." So it's amazing. So you just made me think of that. Sorry.
Well, I saw something with was it Jocko Willink, and he was saying something about you teach these people these techniques, and then you say, okay, now go fight, and the guy's like, I was trying to do that technique, he wouldn't let me. I said, well, yeah, it's a fight, so you
I know my students do that all the time. You just show that to me. It doesn't work. I said, no, I know what you're gonna do. I'm not gonna let you do it.
Yeah. Well, I always like, to me, the funniest thing is when I'm rolling with these guys that forever and ever, and one of the guys who's he just got to purple, I think, and I said, oh, well, now you're purple belt, so obviously you won't fall for this again, and of course he doesn't. It's like, well, I've been doing that to him for 5 years, and the reason why I've been doing it to him for 5 years is because presumably he was defending it better, but I was getting better at
doing
it.
It's an arms race.
It's an arms race, and yes, and he was just at one point he just sort of shrugged. This guy, he's shrugged, well, yeah, it's like, I know if it goes there, that's going to happen because it's going to happen. So the only way to not have that happen is to not go there.
Stop it
before you go there. But if I can force you to choose between A or B, and you have to choose one of them, then I'm going to succeed, right? Because and you're not even angry anymore.
So I spawn a lot of frustration intentionally in my classes sometimes with students, and I stole something from Carlson Gracie that I heard many years ago. Somebody asked him in the middle of a seminar or something he was doing, how do you get out of the triangle? Tap.
Yeah.
And I do that all the time to my students, and they get mad. And why would I show you how to get out of something before you've even experienced it?
Yeah.
Because the real problem is you have to be able to sense when it's about to happen.
Yeah.
And you have to build up that kinesthetic awareness. And how do you do that? By getting caught in it 10,000 times.
Yeah.
And then you learn that, oh, that's what's coming, and you learn to stop it. And then you start to learn how to get out of it, because there's always somebody better that is going to get you in it. So that's when you get the eject handle, is after you know that it's coming.
Well, I think what's really funny is how many, for a higher belt, if someone catches you or you catch some higher belt or you get them in a rear naked choke.
Mm-hmm.
People are pissed off that they got caught. They're not angry at you. They're angry at themselves because they feel like, how could I get caught in that? I mean, come on.
Right.
And, you know, and it's like certain things you get annoyed because you're like, I shouldn't get caught in that. No matter who's unless it's some visiting person for a seminar. Okay, you know, we had Gordon Ryan in, and he, okay, but you get someone and they get and even a lower belt starts getting to this point where like, I'm not supposed to get caught in that.
But that's the thing is, do you get by rolling with different people is it may be the same move, it may be the same end result, but the entry was different, the setup was different. There was a distraction that you haven't seen before, and that's what my point to highlight a lot when I tell people this is you have to be aware of the vulnerability that you have in that moment, and tapping, and I'm not the best example of this because I hate tapping as well, but it's not the end of the world. It's I just learned something today, and I just learned something that I had a vulnerability or I had an opening that I didn't know I had, and you just showed it to me. So thank you.
Yeah,
you know that.
But I think the more interesting phenomenon in all of this is everybody has the person who's like their kryptonite.
Yep.
And it's not like an obvious thing. It's not like, you go in there and this guy like, he's just gonna. And there's some people who like, however they are.
Yep.
It's like suddenly you've like you can't fight. That person is almost impossible to fight.
Yeah, I used to roll with my friend Jair Morcelli. He's a black belt under Deco, and he just for years, and I would intentionally want to roll with him all the time. Because he would he was always dismembering my guard, and it took me a long time to figure out what he was doing. And I was but it's frustrating, but you can learn so much from that. As well.
If you can get yourself to roll with them.
Yeah.
Because I felt myself over the course of the week, and I would, and I was always caught between there's the altruistic aspect, which is, one should roll with lower belts to help them with their game and let them do stuff. And then there's pursuing your game by rolling with all these higher belts. And sometimes I sort of split it during the week, but then sometimes it's really like, oh, I'm tired. I don't want to go get smashed. The first day back, New Year's, got back on the mat, they had open mat. Okay, come in. I was like, awesome. I think I rolled 3 black belts and 2 brown belts the first day back, New Year, and I was like, okay, I'm good for the year. And I don't even count whatever the lower belts that I might have rolled with that day. I don't even remember, but all I remember is, oh shoot, I went in like the first person I rolled with of the year was a really tough, younger guy. He got his black like a month later or something like that. And he said, oh, I feel very good about myself because I went and I didn't do so badly, but and I don't remember, it probably stalemated most people, but I'm always feeling badly, even after I roll with some guy. Oh, so and so just, they just won the gold at, this thing, and they come back and you roll with them, and you're like, man, that was just a stalemate. We didn't, and you're going like, he just killed me. And they're like, well, but you didn't tap again. You didn't tap, right? Now, I'm a counter attacker, so I'm not, I'm sandbagging until you make a mistake.
Right. Well, that's part of the game.
Yeah. But I'm also,
I would argue 90% of the game is waiting for the other person to make a mistake and capitalizing on it.
Well, but that's a style, right?
Or forcing the mistake, right?
Well, it's when you get to the aggressive person, the person who's really good and aggressive and young, and they're just, and okay. But so then I'm trying to overcome my desire not to tap and say, I don't want to roll with those higher belts because my chance of an attack goes up. And with a lower belt, I could pretend like I was letting them, good. And then there's the lower belts who feel like they'll actually be thinking, oh man, thanks for letting me work. And you're thinking like, shit. And then You say, "Oh no, I wasn't doing that," and they're like, "Oh no, thank you." And so then you're like, "I'm shield. My ego is shielded
Yeah.
because I appear like such a," and they're thinking,
I
"Oh man,
don't suck. I really don't.
don't suck," and they're thinking, "Oh man, that higher belt was so nice. He let me work. He could have crushed me at any time." It's like, no, no, he couldn't. No, he was
Yeah.
martial arts being legible and lexible, which is to say that you can see it and you can write about it. And I think
Yeah.
what's interesting in jujitsu, and you see it in all of these accounts of, we see it in the movies all the time, right? Which is, can you be incredibly self-conscious of your techniques, where you are, describe them to somebody else who has to have a certain amount of knowledge, and say, okay, so I'm in this position, and what I'm trying to do is get to this other position, and I know that there's this mental, and we talked about this in the earlier part of the interview, the transitions,
Mm-hmm.
right? Can I get to this nice safe place? Okay, I got this position. Can I go from this to this
Right.
other position so that I can do the attack? But I'm afraid to, because when I do that, I have to give up
I
some
lose the
control.
position that I had. Yeah.
Yeah, I lose position and maybe give him a chance, and I have no confidence in that other position. But I'm never going to learn that confidence or that other
Exactly.
position
You got to let go. Right.
until I let go and
Right.
do that. And so that's, but to be mentally in a place, I had an exchange, an email, a Facebook exchange with a friend of mine from college who's also doing jujitsu. And it was a joke about something, but I said to him in response, and he was saying, an entering heel hook from 50-50. And I said, oh, so Lachlan Giles instead of Danaher. And he said, well, yeah, he says, I have both, but I prefer, and it's this connoisseurship, this, we can have that conversation that shows up in the Kung Fu movies. Like, I see you're doing that technique. So you're obviously
Right.
taught by this guy. And that's back to your lineage question. And we're always trying to develop more knowledge and more capability in ourselves. And it's really
Right.
hard. And then it's even harder to teach someone else.
Well, it's funny because when you talk about having that conversation and that they did that in the Kung Fu movies, for example, one of the agendas I've had with when I started this YouTube channel 5 years ago now was we specifically were only putting out applications and the work that we've been doing to try to reverse engineer these moves out of the forms and from Mantis boxing. And one of the agendas I've had is if I do nothing else in my life, I want to at least change the conversation in Chinese martial arts, Chinese boxing, to a conversation like if two people get together from Chinese boxing, that they have a conversation like you're having with your friend in BJJ about, well, what way do you like to do a neck clinch? Which way do you like to apply a skipping knee or a leg hook takedown? Instead of who'd you study with? What forms did you know? Whose teacher did you live with? Or it's just like this ridiculous nonsense that is completely non-essential or arbitrary. It's like, who cares? Let's talk about the art. Let's talk about how you apply it. And because it's been so fractured and disassembled in the last 120 years, that conversation doesn't take place because a lot of people don't have that level of knowledge on how the boxing works from China. So they can't have that conversation. So it becomes completely superficial about all we can talk about is, can you speak the language? Can you write the language? Who is your teacher? And is he Chinese? Or did you go to China?
Well, so I tell you the funny story on that one, which is, I said my wife is a Chinese architectural historian.
Yeah.
And she spent a lot of time in China. And, I'm a textual historian. I don't, and most of the texts that I use, basically everything, is available. I don't have to go to China to get it. I mean, particularly now. There used to be a time when I started, you had to at least go to the bookshops in China or
Right.
Taiwan, because you couldn't, nowadays you can just get online and look stuff up. I mean, I still go and get stuff, but she said to me in graduate school, and I had no sense of this because I'm not sensitive to those sorts of things, which is that there is a group of people for whom you have to have spent time in China to be valid as a Chinese researcher. Now, I mean, we're talking, martial arts, right? So people, I want to go back to Shaolin and study there, or I guess you have to go to Dongfeng, which is where the schools are actually. But this notion that if you didn't go there, if you're not there, and then what you're doing is not, how can you be valid? And I was bothered by that. Of course, when I was in graduate school, you're very vulnerable, so you feel very bothered. Now, of course, I'm not, but also I've been there enough. But there was a certain point where it was like, for the good of your career, you have to go spend time there.
Yeah. I almost did last year the research that I did for the conference in LA was not really what I was researching. It was a byproduct of the lineage tracing and the history I'm trying to do with Mantis. And I spun it off for something for the conference. But in the research I was doing last year, I said to Holly, I said, I think I need to go to Yantai. And just, if nothing else, just to have boots on the ground and say that I've been there, or look around, or see if I could pick anything. See, maybe I could wander into a museum or a shop and find something that I can't find on the internet or can't find in a library.
Yeah. And you have to say, is that so everybody's grasping for some measure, and this is when you're in a humanities function, not a scientific function, which is, how do we never make 100% argument in human activity. So, it's like this question, would Bruce Lee have beaten this guy in a fight? And then it's like, how would you determine that?
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's all, if you use all this study and you become self-aware, which I think is the thing that we all would like to be. Well, I'm not saying I would like to be, you would like to be, I'm not sure other people are trying to be self-aware. Then you find out that the practice leads you to greater self-awareness.
Yeah.
Why do I think what I think? Is what I think true? Is it an arbitrary distinction? Is an arbitrary statement? My comparison is, if I say to you, what's your favorite color? And you say blue, and I say, you're wrong.
Exactly. Yes. Well, this happens in Chinese boxing all the time.
Yeah. But if I say to you, what color is that car over there?
Right.
And it's a red car, and you say blue, you're wrong. Right. It's a sort of, if you take this position, so if you get into, I was having this getting passed a lot at this one point, and one of the, I think it was a brown, he's a black belt now, but he said to me, why are you letting me get grips on both of your knees? And I said, well, I was trying to figure out, because I was told don't do that. What he said is, you can never let, one is bad, but you can't, if he's got your pants on both knees, he's going to pass you.
Yeah.
And I said, I was trying to figure out if there was a way for that not to be true. And he said, you arrogant bastard.
Good luck with that.
He said, and he was joking, but he's like, what an arrogant thing. Like they say to you, don't do this. Yeah. And I was sitting there for a while, like, can I somehow, is there some response where, it's that thing of, I know that if he has those grips, he's going to try to pass like this.
Right.
Knowing that, is there something I can do that will take that will get that gap? Because he's confident. He knows, I'm going to do this, I'm going to pass. And if I can have a response that he has not thought of, get him, that'll be awesome, because then I will totally, but it doesn't exist.
Well,
so now,
because I've seen that work in an opposite with Hanan Borges, BJJ black belt, and on our team, he was competing. This was probably 6 years ago, the IBJJF in Boston, the Summer Open, and he let the guy he had his lapel and he let the guy run his back, get his hooks in. The guy thought he was in this awesome position. He loop choked him over his shoulder from the from the back mount, and tapped him out. I was like, what just happened?
Yeah.
Like, I had to watch that video playback 500 times to like, oh my God. And so I've seen it work where he just let him get to that. Really, the guy was so confident that he had that amazing position, but he went to sleep.
That's not what happened for me. I had to basically.
Well, I'm just giving you aspirations to look forward to.
No, so then I realized, okay, I just can't let that happen. So then I start, and then you get a lower belt who's really frustrated because they're saying like, I'm going to pass, and you won't let them get that grip.
Yeah.
And so then they're like, what am I supposed to do now that you're not letting me get the grip that I need to try to do the technique I just learned? Well, I don't want you to do that technique.
So I don't want to take too much more of your time. You said something a little while ago about people studying different style, like nobody that was noteworthy did one thing.
Yeah.
And I just want to throw these names out there. It's just make me feel better, I guess, to get it off my chest. So in Yan Tai, in the late Qing dynasty, probably after the Boxer uprisings, from what I can tell, these are some guys that all branched out from this one line of, if there was a Mantis boxing before this, which is questionable.
Yeah.
They all went and opened or taught somebody else under a different brand. Mm-hmm. One was 7 Star, one was Tai Chi Mantis, another was Meihua Tai Chi Mantis, because we need to be different than that guy. And but what was interesting is all of them. So Jiang Hualong studied Lo Han Chuan and Huo, is that monkey?
Ho
H-O-U? Yeah. Ho Chuan. Song Zide, Zide, Z-I-D-E. Zide. Song Zide. Lo Han Chuan and Ho Chuan as well. Hao Lian Ru studied Lo Han Chuan, which I know Lo Han Chuan is just, who knows what it's like.
Well, it's the Lohan is this Buddhist figure.
Right. So. I mean, that was the reverse accreditation. It's really just what could be family art, could be the local. Wang Rongshen studied Chongchuan, which is again this just whatever. Ditong, and then whatever his Biaosher teacher taught him, if anything. But it's interesting because they are all come from these other backgrounds. Yeah. This mix of other styles, other arts. Yeah. And they're results of their forms that somehow people kept immaculately intact for the last 120 years, relatively unchanged, have remnants of plum blossom in them. So it just goes back to what you're saying is these guys all did different stuff. None of it was, we did this and only this, and you're committing the worst sin if you go study boxing at all when I'm trying to teach you jiu-jitsu.
Well, and that's where the MMA ethos, I think, is very nice in that it's about effectiveness.
Yes.
And trying not to, but it's interesting because anyone who's trying to run a school, as you do, actually at some point, you have to have some kind of curriculum and a promotion system, and because people want to feel that progress, and we need that. We want to feel like we're not just nowhere.
I also found for this, and I learned this lesson the hard way, just because you've reached this level of enlightenment where you realize that it's all the same stuff, that the names of things don't matter, the styles don't matter, that's found in Greco-Roman wrestling, and it's found in Mongolian wrestling. The same exact move developed on opposite sides of Asia, different time period. But just because we may know that doesn't mean that a beginner needs to hear it or can even comprehend things on that level. And if somebody comes through your door because they have this idea that they want to learn judo, they saw judo and judo is the best thing ever, and they come in and you say, well, I'm going to show you shuai jiao.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Labels are extremely important for us.
Yeah.
Early on.
Well, I mean, I teach undergraduate classes, and what I expect in an undergraduate class at an intro level is different, because you realize there's only so much you can teach someone at any given time, and you have to teach. You can't destroy all of their concepts at once. You know,
welcome to my school. Let me crush your entire world.
Yeah, and then expect you to come back and say, okay, now that you showed me everything, so you have to kind of. When I was learning Chinese back in the 80s, and we'd sort of do first year Chinese, and they said, okay, here are all these rules. Oh, great, I did my first year. And they come back in second year and say, okay, all those things we told you rules are not rules. Here's this stuff. And then you go through your second year, and then they come back and third, like, okay, those are not rules either. And they, well, wait a minute, okay. So I
have one of my students that is constantly infuriated that he's like, you keep changing the rules on me.
Yeah.
Like, no, you needed to hear that then. You
don't
need to hear that now.
And that's the skill of teaching. And it's very hard, because we're not Yoda. We'd like to be, and we'd like to find our own Yoda who's going to tell us the right thing we need to advance, who we can totally trust. That's why I think most of us are so frustrated with Luke, right? Because it's like, you got Yoda.
Yeah.
And Yoda says, do this, don't do that. And you're like, no. You're like, why? You're an idiot. I mean, it's Yoda, right? And of course he's right. Of course he's right. And of course the problem for Yoda that makes him tragic, he's seen the future. He knows you're not going to listen to him.
Right. But he's doing it anyway. Yeah. One of my favorite quotes about teaching that I saw years ago, and I can't even remember who wrote it or where I saw it, was a teacher takes you where you need to be, not where you want to be.
Yeah, but you got to make them think it's where they want to be.
Yeah, exactly. That's the trick.
Yeah, or I try to take the position that if you come and ask me a question, I should answer your question and not just say to you, well, you're asking the wrong question. Because first I have to answer your questions before you're going to be open to me saying, now that I've answered that, you might consider this. Whereas if I say to you, no, then you're going to say, well, screw you, you didn't answer my question. But that's very hard to do, because a lot of the things that I study are go against our.
But I do want to thank you for your time and taking time out of your day, especially these days, answering some of these questions. And
yeah, no, it was great, and I really enjoyed when I got to train with you up in Boston. It made that trip a lot more fun.
Oh, you're always welcome. I know it was a little out of the way from where you were staying, but
yeah, well, I'm still annoyed that I didn't get there early enough to do the Mantis part of it, but it was still a lot of fun. I mean, well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you today, and I look forward to seeing this up on the internet.